All right, Jacob, are you ready for me to start it? Just a little early so people can get on and stuff.
Yeah, sure. Just let people in.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm still seeing our attendee numbers going up, so I'm going to give it another 15 seconds before we start this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. All right. Thanks for being here, everyone. My name is Catherine Houston. I'm actually the TRPA paralegal. And I'm going to be here moderating this presentation on the fundamentals of planning in Tahoe. That's going to be given by Jacob Stock, a senior planner in TRPA's Long Range Planning Division. This webinar is building on the information shared in the TRPA 101 presentation on January 27th. If you haven't had a chance to view that one or want to refresh, the recording is up on tahoeliving.org. And we definitely recommend you do that. It will make this presentation more enriching, and they're intended to be kind of building blocks, one on top of the other. We did also want to acknowledge feedback that we received on the TRPA 101 webinar that was really helpful. Specifically on the pace and the scope of that webinar. And so we want to highlight some changes that we made in response. First of all, I am not a planner, and I'm going to be here moderating this webinar. So I will be working to keep an ear out for any jargon or unexplained acronyms that can sneak up on our planning professionals and just help to keep us all on the same page. And secondly, we will be answering questions submitted via the Q&A box. And this time the audience will be able to see all the questions submitted, not just the ones that we're answering. And we're going to be a little bit more focused on using the time here today to answer questions that are within the scope of this webinar topic, which is the fundamentals of planning. If you submit a question that we don't specifically answer here today, you're welcome to email that to us at housing@trpa.gov. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this webinar series is aimed at helping folks build knowledge to better engage with TRPA's Cultivating Community, Conserving the Basin initiative. Cultivating Community, Conserving the Basin is a project aimed at making housing more affordable and accessible in the Tahoe Basin while achieving environmental goals. So today, while Jacob will be sharing a general overview of planning, he will be tying it back to TRPA and to what's most important for the Cultivating Community project. Next slide, please. And one more time, I'd like to thank Sandra Rentas for being here today. She helped us last time with Spanish interpretation, and she is doing the same thing today. If you would like Spanish interpretation for this meeting, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says English, and then you can switch to Spanish language. And our Spanish language presentation is posted at tahoeliving.org if you'd like to follow along there too. And Kaylee just put that link in the chat. Thanks, Kaylee. If you're joining us today by phone and you have a question, since you won't be able to use the Q&A box, You can dial *9 to raise your hand, and then *6 to toggle and unmute yourself. And I'll read out the last 4 digits of your phone number if you are using that option. For everyone else joining us via the Zoom app on your computer, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to enter questions at any time. Please refrain from using the chat function. And then another reminder that this is being recorded and it will be posted to tahoeliving.org under the resources tab. And with that, I will give it to you, Jacob.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Jacob Stock. You'll be getting to know a little bit more about me through this presentation, but I just wanted to follow up on some things that Catherine said before I get started. So as she mentioned, this presentation is part of Cultivating Community, Conserving the Basin, a multi-year planning and policy project aimed at improving access to affordable and workforce housing while protecting the environment. And we've got a special focus on building more equity into our growth management system and fees. This presentation is really meant to provide some general background on regional planning to help you engage with the Cultivating Community project and with our other planning efforts more generally. So we won't cover everything today. This is the second part in an educational series that will cover a range of topics related to planning in the Lake Tahoe region. We realize there is a lot that can be included in these presentations, and we welcome your suggestions for future presentations. We hope that these webinars can help get community members up to speed, so that more people can engage better with this process and help shape the changes that we need in the basin. So there is a lot we can go over, and we're in a bit of a learn by doing phase right now. So we welcome any feedback, and we're committed to continuing to tailor our content to best meet the needs of the community. So just let us know. Based on your feedback, the feedback we got during the last webinar, we're going to keep the question and answers session focused on questions relevant to this webinar, as Catherine mentioned. And if you want to go deep into any particular topic, this would not be the opportunity, but we encourage you to share your ideas through our survey at the end and by email at housing@trpa.gov. If someone could throw that into the chat so people have that, that would be great. You can share your questions there. Next slide, please. So let's start with our learning objectives for this afternoon. One of the reasons we're doing a general overview of planning is so that people can understand how the rules here in Tahoe came about. It's also helpful to understand what about Tahoe's system is similar to other areas and what's different. In our first webinar of this series, we provided an overview of the history of TRPA and the role that the agency plays in the Tahoe Basin. In this session, we'll talk more about the fundamentals of regional planning and how we do planning at Tahoe. So as Catherine mentioned, I'll be keeping it general, but trying to tie in the presentation back into cultivating community and planning for affordable housing where I can. Next slide. So a little bit of basic background. TRPA was established in 1969 as a compact between California and Nevada, responding to uncontrolled development and pollution in the Tahoe Basin. Our mission is to lead the collaborative effort to preserve, restore, and enhance the unique natural and human environment of the Lake Tahoe region. We do this through collaboration with partner agencies and with the public, and also through policies and regulations on land use, which we'll talk a lot about in this presentation. We create a shared system of land use planning across the 2 states and multiple jurisdictions to help protect our unique natural resources. So in a nutshell, that's really what regional planning is, and that'll be the focus of today's webinar. As for me, I'm an accredited planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners. I studied regional planning in school and chose this career because I love thinking about complex problems and trying to solve them. So one complex problem, that's the focus of regional planning, is looking at how our actions shape the world around us and how that world then turns around and shapes us back. Next slide. Okay, so maybe that sounded a little bit like jargon. Sorry about that, Catherine. So I'll give an example from my former employer, that's Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe was designed in 1610, following what's called known as the Laws of the Indies. The Laws of the Indies was one of the first ever planning and design codes, and it set out laws that were applied to Spanish colonies from Florida to Peru to the Philippines. Um, the Laws of the Indies set a standard design including a public plaza surrounded on four sides by a church, military barracks, and government offices and commercial businesses. And so here you can see a map of Santa Fe, more modern than the original design, 1882, but an example of a city that was built on this basic design code. Next slide. And so fast forward to today, that plan is still very much reflected in downtown Santa Fe. As the city has grown, modestly, that is, that growth reflects and reinterprets those old rules for building placement and design. I mean, just you can take a look here on the upper right. You can see a charming Adobe Starbucks. So some people might call this Santa Fe's charm, but the city has also struggled to adapt its narrow roads to a modern car-based transportation economy. So planning can create this sense of character or sense of place, as we often call it, but it also sets a course for the future. It involves vision, it involves trade-offs, and it results in unintended consequences. Next slide. So what even is planning and why is it important? Let's start with that. Next slide. The American Planning Organization is our professional organization for city planners and regional planners, and they define planning as a collaborative process that involves creating communities that improve the lives of residents. Okay, that's pretty broad. If we want to get a little more specific, planning is about shaping the built environment, shaping the way buildings and infrastructure are placed in the landscape. So I like this other definition a lot. This is from another region. It says that planners arrange buildings, roads, infrastructure, and environmental protections to serve a community or region's long-term needs. So you might be thinking after hearing these phrases like improve the lives of residents, region's long-term needs. These are really subjective. How do we come up with that? They can mean something different to almost anyone. I'll take a bit of time. I'll talk a bit more about how we determine these long-term needs in the next slide. All that said, planning is incredibly varied, and depending on where you live, it can take a very different shape. In Tahoe, our planning system is guided by strict environmental standards called thresholds, which partly determine what can and should be developed where. This creates barriers, but also provides guidelines for protecting the environment, kind of like the trade-offs I mentioned in my earlier example.
And
So,
Jacob, can
yeah,
I just interrupt you for 1 minute?
sure.
Where do the thresholds come from?
Well, the thresholds come from they're based on the compact between the states of the agreement between the states of California and Nevada require us to establish thresholds, and those thresholds are laid out in the Tahoe Regional Plan, which I'll talk about in a couple slides.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Um, Okay, so what do planners do? Planners use a number of tools to shape communities. The most basic of those tools is a goal. So we work with community members through open public engagement to understand community needs and craft a broad vision for what we want the future to look like. This is where we start getting at the needs of the community and future vision that I mentioned in the previous slide. So for example, we might work with the community and set a goal of bringing more fresh pizza into our community. There's not enough fresh pizza, and we set a goal and say we want to see more fresh pizza in our community. Next, we need to set a course for accomplishing that goal. That's where policies come in. Again, working with our community, we produce an aspirational statement defining how we will accomplish our goal. This is called a policy. In this case, we might all agree to promote pizza restaurants in our town center districts, where they can be more easily accessed by residents and visitors, and where we have the infrastructure to support more pizza ovens. So now it's time to implement those policies. The most important tools for government agencies like TRPA to implement policies are zoning and land regulations. This includes dividing the land into zones with different allowed uses and setting enforceable rules to implement our policies, to implement those aspirational statements. Here, planners need to balance policies and goals with the potential consequences and with property rights. When adopting regulations and zoning, we might work with pizza experts and look at examples of other successful pizza economies to craft our zoning regulations. We might want to allow neon signs to advertise pizza restaurants, but also include rules to address pollution from pizza ovens. We might set parameters for outdoor dining and create special parking areas for pizza delivery trucks. We might also create a pizza district to encourage the concentration of pizza businesses in one area, or allow pizza restaurants broadly across different zoning districts. So next slide, please. So that's goals, policies, and regulations. So let's talk about how this all works at TRPA. The Bi-State Compact, so that's the agreement between the states of California and Nevada, created TRPA to set goals, policies, and regulations for the whole basin, both sides of the lake, Nevada and California. The 2012 regional plan sets goals and policies for the region. So it was developed through a big public process. You can probably imagine that this was a pretty difficult task that involved a lot of hard work and compromise between different groups of people. The rules and regulations based on those goals and policies are in the TRPA Code of Ordinances. We also have what are called area plans. These plans set more detailed policies and regulations for local areas. This is where you'll find more detailed zoning, for example, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. There are 6 area plans covering all of Washoe and Placer counties, part of Douglas County, the city of South Lake Tahoe, and El Dorado County. And currently, El Dorado County is working on an area plan that will cover their entire jurisdiction, their entire county, and the link to the website for that planning process is here on the slide. We encourage you to check that out. So while TRPA sets higher level regional policy and regulations, local governments can set their own local rules as well. And where there's conflict between local rules and regional rules, the stricter standards apply. Also, another important note is that TRPA can't own land. So public works, emergency services, other physical public projects are managed by the local governments. Next slide. So what are the goals and policies of the regional plan? Again, like I mentioned before, the regional plan is where the goals and policies for our region live. So first we have threshold standards, like Catherine mentioned. These are measurable standards unique to Tahoe. Not everywhere has a planning system based on threshold standards. Our policies are designed to meet those standards for things like water clarity and traffic. We have a land use element. This sets goals and policies for housing, what we want our built environment to look like, and water quality, etc. The regional plan also has goals and policies for transportation, conservation of natural resources, recreation, and public services. There is also an implementation element, which outlines how to accomplish these policies. This includes partnerships with other government agencies like the Forest Service, local governments, community organizations, uh, how to finance these policies, policy implementation, how to monitor progress on implementing our policies, and of course, regulations through the Code of Ordinances. Next slide. So that brings me to the code. At my last count, the TRPA Code of Ordinances had 718 pages. That's if you include the cover page. And it includes a whole spectrum of the region of regulations concerning how land is used in the Tahoe Basin. This list is just a few examples of the types of regulations in the code that relate directly to housing affordability. There's a lot more than just this in the code. We have project review standards, so how building projects are reviewed and permitted. Lists of permissible uses. These are all of the types of things that people can use their land for in Tahoe, like single-family housing, multifamily housing, restaurants. All these uses are allowed in some places and not allowed in other places based on the zoning. We have limits to the amount of land that can be covered on property, called coverage, another thing that's a little bit unique in Tahoe. Standards for how buildings should be designed, and development rights. We'll have a whole presentation just on development rights next month. Development rights are really important because they restrict the amount of development that can occur in the Tahoe Basin. And Tahoe's development rights system is very complex and really unique among regional planning systems. So we'll discuss this more thoroughly next time. That's going to be March 24th, and we'll send you more information about that later. All these regulations and more combine to shape community aesthetics and impact the cost to build and live in the Tahoe region. They're also really important to meeting the goals and policies of the regional plan, including the environmental protections that we have here in the basin. Next slide. So I mentioned area plans earlier. Local governments in Tahoe can also adopt area plans, which set more detailed policies and regulations for local areas. Area plans are really important because these documents include local zoning. They split up their areas into zones and define what uses are allowed in those zones and what are not allowed in those zones. Or if a use is allowed, what level of review is required to permit that use. Essentially, area plans are a way for local jurisdictions to make decisions about what they want to see in their communities. And this is beneficial because local governments tend to have more knowledge about the needs of their areas than we do at TRPA. So there's sometimes overlap, as I mentioned, between the regional code and area plans. And where there's conflict, the stricter standard applies, but there is room for change in what is handled at the area plan level versus what is handled at the regional plan level. And there's room for changing standards to adapt to different needs as they arise. And so with that, we can take a little break for questions. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Let's see. If you have a question so far, go ahead and put it in that Q&A box. And Jacob, can you kind of go in a little bit more detail about like the purpose of an area plan? If we have a regional plan, why do we also have area plans?
Yeah, of course, and I'd invite my colleagues to supplement if they have anything to add. But regional or area plans came about in 2012 when we adopted the regional plan. And the idea was that local governments should have more say in creating standards that apply to their local communities. So they have a direct line with their local communities, and um, and they can create standards that reflect what the community needs and um, reflect. Excuse me, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Reflect what the community needs and um, and better reflect a sense of character in the design of buildings, for example, in the placement of different uses. That's why zoning is the purview of local governments.
And specifically, we got a question from a attendee. Thank you. The South Shore Area Plan, which is Douglas County's area plan, will be heard by the APC, the Advisory Planning Commission, excuse my acronym, this Wednesday at TRPA. Let's see. And just to get a little bit deeper on this topic, who oversees an area plan amendment?
So area plan amendments are always initiated by the local government. So usually what will happen is a local government will come to TRPA staff, long range planning staff, and they'll say, we want to make an amendment to our area plan. And TRPA staff will review that and oversee their work on it and help usher it through the hearing process. So ultimately, the decision on whether an amendment is approved or not approved is made first by the county commission or supervisors or city council of whatever government brought it forward, and then by the TRPA governing board gets the final say on approving it.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we got another question. The slides referenced quote unquote workforce housing and then quote unquote affordable housing. Is TRPA making a distinction between these? And if so, what is it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, affordable housing is is defined in the Code of Ordinances. So that's something that has a clear definition, and it's based on area median income of the people who are living in that housing, and that definition is applied then to things like deed restrictions and access to different standards or incentives. When we use the term workforce housing, this is more of a nebulous term that we like to use to encompass all of this type of housing that serves the workers of the Tahoe region. So that's not something that's specifically defined in the Code of Ordinances, but sometimes we need to use terms that are broader in order to cover the range of different types of housing that we need. So sometimes we'll say workforce housing or workforce and affordable housing to broadly mean housing for workers and families in the Tahoe region.
Would you say that's like a more all-encompassing term then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, more encompassing term, not as legally defined as affordable housing.
Awesome. Um, okay, another question. And so this relates to TRPA's phase two, as we called them, housing amendments that passed in December of 2023. And TRPA added amendments to the regional plan that the local jurisdictions must add within a year. And how does that work?
I mean, that's a pretty specific question. Um, I think that's one that's probably better directed towards email, I can say how we're implementing that. Um, we're working with the local jurisdictions to amend their area plans, um, in response to the changes that were made in the regional plan and to bring them into conformance.
And I know we have Alyssa Bettinger on the line. Maybe she can help us answer that question on the line on the webinar.
Yeah, I can weigh in on this. Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Bettinger. I'm also a senior planner in the long range planning department. And yeah, this is related to the phase 2 amendments that our board adopted back in December of last year. And basically, our code allows for specific instances where we make changes to the code and we require the local jurisdictions to then adopt those same changes. And so we do have a rule in our code that says the local jurisdictions have a year to adopt these changes or basically come into conformance with our code and the changes that we did make. And so we don't do this very often, but we did. This is the phase 2 housing amendments were an instance where we did exercise that power that we have in our code, and we're working with the local jurisdictions right now to bring them and their area plans into conformance with the changes that we made. And this is for deed restricted workforce and affordable housing.
Thanks, Alyssa. And then we'll do one more question, I think, before we move on with the presentation, Jacob, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And this is actually John Hester is also available on the webinar. I'm going to call you to the front, John. How do improvement districts such as Incline Village General Improvement District or IVGID fit into this process? Would they work through the county or through TRPA?
I can't get my camera to turn on, but I can turn off my mute. They would work through the county.
Great. Thanks, John. All right, Jacob, let's keep it going.
Yeah, let's keep going. Can we go next to the next slide? And next slide after that too. Okay, cool. So professional planners can specialize in a range of different areas. There are airport and freight planners, parks planners, planners specializing in affordable housing. Planners help develop regional infrastructure through capital improvement plans. We don't have a capital improvement plan here at TRPA, but we do have an environmental improvement plan for environmental and restoration projects, and we have a transportation improvement plan for transportation infrastructure. So those are some different types of planning. I'm going to focus on the three main types of planning work that planners do here at TRPA. We have permitting and compliance, sometimes also called current planning. These are the planners that review applications for building projects and apply zoning rules and regulations. We have transportation planners, and they're responsible for goals and policies related to roads, sidewalks, bike lanes, transit, and other transportation infrastructure. They also plan and work with partners to implement improvements to our transportation system. And then there are folks like me and Alyssa, who you just saw, long-range planners who specialize in policies and regulations related to how land is used. Next slide. So first, let's get into just a little bit more about the permitting side of planning. So when someone comes to start a building project, they send an application to permit planners who review that building application first to confirm that it's complete, and then to make sure that it follows the zoning and regulations in the code and in any local plan, like a local area plan. In Tahoe, some local governments have an agreement with TRPA to review and approve some projects on their own. But still, all projects must comply with TRPA regulations, and projects of a certain size or in sensitive areas like along the lakeshore need to be reviewed and approved by TRPA directly before they can be built. So there are two broad ways that a permit can be approved or denied. For smaller projects like private homes in areas that aren't environmentally sensitive, so in a home in a neighborhood, um, those can receive a permit after staff review if they meet all of the regulations and the zoning. So this is called a ministerial approval. It's just a project that can be approved by staff. Larger projects are projects requiring rule or projects that require rule changes, need to be reviewed and approved by a higher authority. So for example, some projects need to be approved by the TRPA governing board. That's the highest level of approval for a project. These are called discretionary approvals. There are some opportunities, or excuse me, there are some opportunities to deny ministerial approval, but there are more opportunities to deny a discretionary permit. And it's important to note here that in many cases, apartment housing requires discretionary review, but single family housing does not. So a single private residence can be approved by staff, but apartment buildings would need to be approved by a higher authority. So that can make it harder to build less expensive housing. And it's something that we've been asked to look at in this Cultivating Community project. Next slide. So our transportation planners work with state departments of transportation, bus services, local governments, and residents to set transportation policy and plan projects. The regional transportation plan sets goals and policies for our transportation system every 4 years, and our planners are working on updating that actually this year. TRPA is also what's called a metropolitan planning organization, which means that our staff work to plan infrastructure connecting our region with surrounding regions. Next slide. Okay, my favorite part, long-range planning. So long-range planners work with the community to set regional goals and policies, and then translate those goals and policies into land regulations and zoning so that they can be implemented. We study problems as they arise, like, for example, the need for more pizza restaurants, or maybe more importantly, the need for more affordable housing, and adapt our goals and policies and regulations to try to address those problems. In Tahoe, we also assist local government planners as they adapt their area plans. I also really want to emphasize the importance of community engagement in our work. So on every policy project, we set a course for working with the community to make sure plans reflect what the community members want and need for their neighborhoods, their communities. Of course, we can always do better at this, and the same old public engagement methods often need to be refreshed. In cultivating communities in particular, we're trying to diversify and broaden our participation to include more voices. This is some of the most important, but also the most challenging work that we do as planners, and it's really rewarding. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. Next slide. I mentioned that long-range planners translate goals into policies and policies into regulations in consultation with the community. So one of our goals with this project, with Cultivating Community, Conserving the Basin, is to set policies and regulations that meet our regional workforce housing needs. One policy we can pursue to meet that goal would be to adapt our system to better support workforce housing. Here's an example of a regulation we've used before to accomplish a similar goal. We created a bonus unit boundary, and in that boundary, we gave developers more incentives and extra development rights to build more affordable housing. So along with many other regulations, zoning rules, incentives, disincentives from the city of South Lake Tahoe, this can result in projects like Sugar Pine Village. Next slide. And I want to share some other examples of projects resulting from planning efforts over the years to give you a sense of how planning shapes our built environment. So in this before photo right here, you can see Highway 50 near South State Line. Note how small the sidewalk is. Almost non-existent here. You can see water pooling along the curb because of inadequate drainage. And it's generally lacking a sense of place. Remember, I talked about this concept of place or character earlier in the presentation. Since this area was built out in an unplanned manner and a car-oriented manner before many of the regional policies and regulations for the Tahoe Basin were in place. Next slide. So now here's Heavenly Village. You can see significant improvements to landscaping and walkways, enhancing pedestrian safety and connectivity between the casinos, restaurants, hotels, and other entertainment venues. The upgraded design incorporates stormwater management features in the landscape, which provides environmental benefits while contributing to a more cohesive, attractive streetscape for pedestrians. These improvements started with a planning process that involved visioning, goal setting, policies, and regulations to create a more cohesive sense of place and to achieve some pretty important environmental improvements as well. Next slide. So here's an example at a smaller scale. This is 395 Lake Tahoe Boulevard in Tahoe City. This project took an older, underutilized office space and converted it to housing for the local workforce. It's now a dorm-style building that can house 28 people in 14 rooms with 6 bathrooms and community kitchens. So this was possible because of new regulations that were put in place in 2018 that made it easier for properties to convert from commercial or office spaces into residences. Next slide. So to address challenges and evolving needs like those in the previous slides, long-range planners continuously work to adapt plans and code. This approach is also a key component of cultivating community, conserving the basin. So this graphic here is a very simplified overview of how our plans and code get updated. We start with a public engagement process to define the problem, set goals and development policies. In cultivating community, we're also working with advisory groups like the Tahoe Living Working Group and Community Partner Group throughout to define issues, goals, and policies and to develop our proposal. Once we have a draft proposal, that's further vetted and refined, and it's then analyzed for its impact on the environment. So we have different levels of environmental review. For cultivating community, we'll be using our highest level, which is an environmental impact statement. And if an environmental impact statement identifies impacts to the environment, then we develop a plan to mitigate those impacts. And the proposal goes to our planning commission and finally to the governing board for review and possibly for approval. So I highlighted community engagement at the beginning of the process, but the public has the opportunity for input through every part of this process. We have workshops and open meetings throughout. The public can join and comment on Tahoe Living Working Group meetings, help identify issues for environmental analysis and scoping, and share their thoughts with planners and decision makers all the way up to the final governing board hearing. So the community has an opportunity to engage in multiple different ways throughout the process. Next slide. Okay, so to summarize, in this presentation, I tried to answer the question, what is planning? We learned about the basic tools of planning. Those are goals, policies, regulations, and zoning. We learned how those tools are used at TRPA through the regional plan, area plan, and area plans and code of ordinances, and how those documents can be changed to respond to new challenges. And so I will hand it back to Catherine, and I'll be here to answer more questions along with some of our other TRPA colleagues. So Catherine, take it away.
Thanks, Jacob. And again, thanks everyone for joining us today. One more reminder before I open the floor for some more questions. This is part of a series, this webinar is part of a series of educational presentations. So if there's something that you want to learn more about related to planning for housing, please let us know. We will put a survey link in the chat for you to share your ideas, and we hope to see you at the Growth Management 101, which will be on March 24th at 2 p.m. You'll be able to find the recording of this presentation along with the previous TRPA 101 and any other future presentations at tahoeliving.org. And there you can also sign up for the housing e-news to get the latest updates on the Cultivating Community and housing at Tahoe. And just being mindful of the time, it is 3:44. So we have time for questions. And the first one brings us back. Jacob, we'll start with you. To clarify, going back to ministerial versus discretionary approvals, they're related to the regulations that TRPA in this case puts in place, and those regulations have the potential to change. And so this person is wondering if we can shift the calculus behind the regulations that would make private homes harder to build than multiple units.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. So, that just if anyone wants to go and flip through the code, that's in chapter 2 of the code that lays out what requires a ministerial versus a discretionary approval. And so one of the ways, like the person who posed the question or mentioned is one thing that you could do if you wanted to make it easier for folks to build more affordable housing is to make changes to the level of review that's required for certain types of workforce housing. There are other things that could be changed too, development standards, development fees, growth management standards. There's a number of things in the code that could be changed and that we're researching through this project to make workforce housing easier to build.
Great, thanks, Jacob. And this is another one potentially for you, although also potentially for John Hester. So Hester, feel free to jump in. This person is wondering if you can explain permissible use versus special uses.
Sure.
And let's start there, and then I'll ask part 2.
Well, permissibles actually, and I see that Karen wanted to answer this too, but Karen, if you want to jump in before I do, go ahead. If not, I'll take it. I guess Karen's leaving it to me. Permissible uses are allowed, and they align with the plans. And special uses are uses that can be allowed if they meet certain findings. And the findings are that it's a similar nature, scale, density, intensity, and type of use that's appropriate for the parcel. When you look at the surrounding area, it can't cause public health, safety, property enjoyment, or general welfare negative impacts or injurious impacts. And the third one is shouldn't change the nature or character of the neighborhood. The specific language can be found in our code, which is online under 21.2.2 special uses, and the permissible uses is also there. Hope that answered the question.
So Hester, I'm just gonna push a little bit on that is
Okay,
so special uses it's like an additional code provision that a project has to meet in order to make a special use finding.
correct. If you go into this table I was just talking, as part of the chapter 21 of our code, it lays out what are permissible uses, and it has tables in there and explains all of this. And it also explains secondary and accessory uses, other types of uses. And then special uses are allowed if you can make those findings. Did that help, Catherine? If not, ask me again. You're welcome to push on me as much as you need.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And building off of that explanation, how is a special use approved when designated in an area plan?
I believe I don't have the code in front of me, but I believe that a special use is approved by the hearings officer. It looks like John's flipping through the code. Or denied by the hearings officer.
And that can be appealed to the governing board.
Right. I do want to add just to the discussion of permissible uses that just because a use is designated or is considered a permissible use, it still has to meet all of our building code regulations. So you can't just say, I want to build I'll use the pizza restaurant example. I want to build a pizza restaurant here and we just, put the stamp on and say you get to build your pizza restaurant. You have to meet the building standards, which include building setbacks, where you place it on a parcel, the amount of coverage, the design of the building. There's all kinds of regulations that you still need to meet, even if it's a permissible use.
Great, thanks, Jacob. And I just wanted to clarify, since I already know the answer to this question, hearings officer is just another level of review. So a special use finding has to be approved by staff and then they recommend it or don't to a hearings officer who also has to review the project. And that is in chapter 2 of the code. We're going to jump to environmental review questions. What is the range of different analyses of environmental impact? Do you, as in TRPA, always do an EIS, environmental impact statement? If not, what are the other levels of analysis that you do to evaluate a project's environmental impact?
Yeah. I can get started on that and anyone else can jump in if they'd like. So we always do what's called an IEC, which is an initial environmental checklist. So first, to answer the question, do we always do an EIS? The answer is no. We very rarely do an EIS. We always do an initial environmental checklist, and that is a list of questions that we review and answer based on what we believe the impact of the project will be. There are cases where a project or a policy can be approved on an initial environmental checklist. There are also cases where the checklist finds that, oh, we need to do a higher level of environmental analysis. And so the next highest level would be an environmental assessment or an EA. After that, for really big policy projects, we have an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And there are a list of categories that we have to review in an environmental impact statement. So like traffic impacts, impacts on wildlife, impacts on water quality are a few examples. You can go to the code to see the whole list of examples. But the other cool thing that we do with an EIS is we have a scoping meeting where the community can come out and say, we want you to look at this impact. We think that there's going to be an impact on neighborhood character, for example, from from this change in policy, and we want you to look at that and analyze that specifically in the EIS. So that's one of the things that we can do with an EIS.
Thanks, Jacob. And kind of building on that, it kind of goes in the other direction, but it's good to address. It does seem, the question is, not having an environmental impact statement or not having to do one would help move housing projects along. And so what is the case for needing the environmental impact statement with this initiative?
Right. So I'll let others can jump in if they want again, but in this case, we're looking at making we're wanting to consider some changes to our development rights system, to our fee system, some pretty, meaty policy changes. And we think that it's appropriate to use an environmental impact statement to consider those changes. Now, when those changes are approved, then an actual physical housing project wouldn't be subject to an EIS necessarily. This is just this is a way of analyzing the policy changes that we're working on right now.
Awesome, thanks. Looks like we've got one more question right now, and we've got about 5 minutes left. So if you do have a burning question, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A box. Jacob, could you provide just a basic overview of coverage and what the regulation was intended to accomplish? I.e., like why that exists, why the rule exists. And then we can go on from there, how it's applied to single family homes or other building projects.
Yeah. So I'll go real basic with it, and others can add more if they think it's relevant. But coverage is the limitation. It limits the amount of your parcel, the percentage of your parcel that can be covered by an impervious surface. So a surface that water can't penetrate. And the reason for that is originally was to protect water quality. So when you have more open surface on a piece of land, there's more opportunity for water to filter into the ground and to naturally filter itself and clean itself before it drains ultimately into the lake. And so coverage is this idea that if we limit the amount of space that water can't go in, then we have more space where water is going in and able to be filtered and cleaned. And what was there was another part of that question.
Yeah, there was. Let me, and this is a great time for me to let you know that our coworkers are working behind the scenes to mark questions as answered. So folks can look at the answered tab, and some people are typing answers as well. So a question may have been answered in written form. This is while I'm trying to find that question again.
This is John, I typed one of the answers to it, and I think the other part was, how is it used for a single family home?
Yes, thank you, John.
Sure.
Right. So with any property, there is a percent of the land that can be covered with a house and pavement, and that can't be covered. So, and that's determined by what we call an IPE score, and I'm not going to get into into what that is, but different properties have different percentages that they can cover. So like, for example, my house, I have 30% coverage. So my house and the driveway cover 30% of the of the property, and that's it. I can't do any more. And so, at a basic level, that's how coverage works on a single family home.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Hester. And I did put the link to our information on coverage that's on the TRPA website. That's trpa.gov/land-coverage. And you can learn everything that you've ever wanted to know about it there. While Jacob answers this last question, I'm going to put the link to the survey that I mentioned in the chat, and we'd really appreciate it if you were able to take that survey and give us some feedback. And we touched on this a little bit. I know we're right up on time, Jacob, but one of the goals you mentioned is of cultivating communities is to make workforce housing easier to build. Will the process define what workforce housing means? I assume, or the questioner assumes, that a single family dwelling occupied by a local worker isn't the goal.
Yeah, so what we're looking at is we're going to look at what is the need for workforce housing. What are the number of units that we need to meet our goal of providing housing for the workforce, and then what type of housing that is. So what are the target incomes, lower income, moderate income, above moderate income, maybe in some cases for like, nurses and firefighters, folks like that. And then what are the types of housing that we can build with the land and the land that we have available, and that folks would be interested in living in. So these are some of the pieces that we're analyzing. I think in some cases, a single family dwelling local, depending on the size of that dwelling, could be if it's occupied by a local worker, could be part of the goal. So we're kind of that's part of what we're looking at this point in the project.
Great, thanks. And I see that Karen also added some additional information as an answer to that question. So again, folks, the questions may have been answered in writing, and you can see that in the answered tab. All right, I am going to go ahead and say thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Sandra, for translating, and Jacob for presenting, and everyone working behind the scenes to pull this webinar off.
Thanks, Catherine, for moderating.
Please take the survey, and we hope to continuously improve as we go. And I'll sign off with go to tahoeliving.org for all your questions to be answered. Thanks, everyone.